Hello and welcome to the questions answered video. My name is Brittany. I am a menstrual educator and a trained teacher in natural fertility education. And I'm here today to answer some questions about the menstruation and ovulation cycle. So I invite you to get out a notepad, a pen and paper, and to take some notes as I am going through these questions. So question number one, what are the signs of ovulation? So before we can actually answer question number one, we need to ask the question, what is ovulation? So when we think about the menstrual cycle, we think about two major events. We think about menstruation, which is bleeding, and we think about ovulation. And ovulation is when the egg exits the follicle, it exits the ovary, and it moves towards the fallopian tube. This is ovulation. It's when the release happens. So the egg moves outside of the follicle and the ovary. And so we can ask the question now, what are the signs of ovulation? So we can think about primary signs and we can think about secondary signs. So primary signs of ovulation are one, cervical mucus and temperature. We're going to come back to these in a little bit. And then we've got secondary signs, and secondary signs can change between women, and they can occur and they might not occur. So this includes libido, heightened libido, heightened energy, the possibility of sore breasts, and also mid-cycle spotting. A little bit of spotting blood can occur at ovulation for some women. So now the question is, how can I pinpoint the timing of ovulation by observing these signs? So when we think about pinpointing the timing of ovulation, we think about using cervical mucus and temperature. So when we look at cervical mucus across the menstrual month, we have a change in cervical mucus. Our cervical mucus moves generally from being dry to moist to wet and then to slippery. And it is that very, very slippery mucus that we call peak mucus. And peak mucus occurs usually 24 hours before ovulation. So observing cervical mucus is a wonderful way to see that you are moving towards ovulation, okay? And then we use temperature as a retrospective method to confirm ovulation. The temperature rises, the basal body temperature rises 0.2 to 0.5 of a degree. And this occurs after ovulation has occurred. So we've got the mucus telling us when the mucus is telling us that we're heading towards ovulation, and the temperature change is telling us that we have had ovulation. So these two together, mucus and temperature, are a wonderful team to really pinpoint ovulation. So why is ovulation important? Well, before I told you about what ovulation is, and I said that the egg jumps out of the follicle and the ovary. So the follicle stays inside the ovary. The follicle was what was surrounding the egg. And that stays in the ovary and it becomes what's known as a temporary endocrine gland, and it starts to secrete the hormone progesterone. And it does this for 11 to 17 days. And this is the time from ovulation to menstruation. So ovulation is wonderful and important because it allows this process to happen. And basically, it is helping our hormone balance, because progesterone is one of the very important hormones of our cycle, along with estrogen and the other hormones. So the fact that we ovulate means that we can be producing progesterone monthly. Next question. What is intermenstrual bleeding? So first of all, to define intermenstrual bleeding, we must define menstruation. And menstruation is the bleeding that occurs 11 to 17 days after ovulation. And I just skipped a question, actually. So I'll just go back because it's quite important to do it in order. So the question before was, does ovulation occur before menstruation, or does menstruation occur before ovulation? So you probably know the answer by now because I was talking about it, but ovulation occurs before menstruation. So even though the blood is the more obvious part of the cycle, it's actually ovulation that occurs first, and then 11 to 17 days later is when menstruation occurs. Okay, so then we can look at intermenstrual bleeding and menstruation, because now we know that menstruation occurs 11 to 17 days after ovulation. So now we know that intermenstrual bleeding, any intermenstrual bleeding, and intermenstrual bleeding is any blood that happens that is not menstruation. So when we know, when we can find out when we ovulate, then we can find out like that it is a menstruation or intermenstrual bleeding. So this is one of the important reasons to be tracking your cycle. And this is what I teach women, is to start to create a charting practice so that you can start to identify ovulation. And then you can really get clear, am I having a menstruation or am I just having an intermenstrual bleed? So what does intermenstrual bleeding indicate and why does it occur? So intermenstrual bleeding can occur for different reasons. Some people have a little bit of spotting, a little bit of blood spotting around ovulation as the hormones are changing there. There can be a little bit of spotting with estrogen withdrawal, and it can also be a sign of dis-ease in the body, especially in the cervix. So if you do experience intermenstrual bleeding, then it's also then it is important to get it checked out by a health professional to rule out any issues. But it's first really useful to find out, is it intermenstrual bleeding or is it menstruation? Now, most women will be able to tell the difference between bleeding and between menstruation and intermenstrual bleeding. Most women know what their monthly menstruation is like, and when they have intermenstrual bleeding, they're like, this isn't quite like, a normal bleed. But if you're not sure, then we use charting, and charting can tell us a whole lot about our cycle. So I've gone over this, but I will reiterate it. How can I tell the difference between intermenstrual bleeding and menstruation? So intermenstrual bleeding is any bleeding that is not menstruation. And menstruation, as we know, occurs 11 to 17 days after ovulation. Next question, what is a regular and an irregular menstrual cycle? So when we think of regular, we think of a cycle that is between 21 and 35 days. So this is our range of regular. And then when we are outside of regular, this means that we have an irregular cycle, and it means that it is important to go to a health professional and be checked out. So we've been talking about cervical mucus and we've been talking about temperature. So the next question is, how do I observe cervical mucus and use it to understand my fertility? Well, observing cervical mucus is something that we do throughout our entire cycle. And we ask the questions. What is the sensation at my vulva as I'm walking to the toilet? And what is the sensation at my vulva as I wipe with toilet paper? So with the symptothermal method, with the symptothermal method that I teach, we're always looking at sensation. We're always sensing into sensation. Some women don't have enough cervical mucus to look at with the eyes, so that's why we use sensation. And the sensation can tell us if it feels dry, if it feels moist, if it feels wet, if it feels slippery, and therefore we can understand our fertility in that way. And especially when we're charting, what happens is that we're charting month after month after month, and we start to develop a language. We start to develop a language for ourselves that we can tell the difference between the different types of cervical mucus. So the next question is, where does cervical mucus come from? So cervical mucus comes from the cervix. Where is the cervix? The cervix is the bottom of the uterus and the top of the vagina. So if you were outside of your vulva, the outside of your genitals, and you moved in through the vulva, you would go up the vagina. And before moving into the uterus, you would go through the cervix. So the cervix has a little hole in the middle of it called the cervical os. And this is where the cervical secretions come out of. And inside the cervix, there are crypts, which is like little channels. And these channels are where the cervical mucus comes from out of these channels and down the cervical os. So there was this cervical mucus has been studied quite in depth by Dr. Odeblad and the Billings team. And Dr. Odeblad, he discovered that there were very different types of cervical mucus. There were cervical mucus that was like sperm transition cervical mucus, which is the very slippery and fertile cervical mucus. And this allows us to be very fertile because it keeps the sperm alive. And then we have the type of cervical mucus that is, I guess, more dry. And that kind of cervical mucus has been known to trap sperm because this cervical mucus is quite acidic in nature, so it doesn't allow the sperm to live. There are different types of cervical mucus. We don't need to get into them too much, but the cervix is amazing and it produces cervical mucus that can that can create fertility and then can create periods in our menstrual cycle that are not fertile. So what about temperature now? How do I observe temperature to use it to understand my fertility? Well, temperature, as I said, is a wonderful method to use alongside cervical secretions. And we use a basal body thermometer and we take our temperature every single morning after 4 to 6 hours of sleep. And this temperature, if we record it every single day, we will notice a rise in our basal body temperature after ovulation. So really, we take our temperatures every single morning and we do so. There are a few rules to go with this. And if you would like to learn about basal body temperature and about cervical mucus more deeply and actually do the charting process, then I invite you into my program, which is Sacred Territory. We track together and we start to demystify the cycle together. So the reason why I'm saying that is just because I'm giving you a small amount of information now, but there is more to it. But basically, we use temperature to understand our fertility by taking temperature daily and then watching for the rise in temperature. A question that often gets asked and is probably one of the most confused aspects of all of this is, can I get pregnant during menstruation? So most women have been told that they cannot get pregnant during menstruation, but if a woman has an early ovulation that month, it is possible to get pregnant during menstruation. So let's say, for example, that it is day 5 of the menstrual cycle and there's blood, but there's also fertile secretions as well at that time. If you're bleeding, you can't really tell if there's fertile secretions because of all the blood. So what might happen is you're bleeding and there's fertile mucus. If sex is happening in this time, then the fertile mucus that is already there can keep the sperm alive until ovulation, right? So sperm can live up to, 6 or 7 or even 8 days. Usually it's around 6 though. So let's just say it was day 5, and then we go 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Say ovulation occurred on day 11 and there was sperm living in that fertile mucus, then there is the possibility to get pregnant. Okay, so therefore it's, you could never take for granted that that you will not get pregnant during menstruation. It is possible in short cycles. And the last question, why and how does stress affect the cycle? So stress hormones actually can lower sex hormones. So when our stress hormones go up, this actually suppresses other hormones such as LH, FSH, estrogen, progesterone. There is a dampening of our sex hormones, and this can often lead to delayed ovulation. So a stress-affected cycle is when there is a movement towards ovulation, but then the hormone levels can't quite get high enough to ovulate and then come back down. And then the hormone levels go up and try again, can't quite make it, come back down. So this is called a stress cycle, and this is delayed ovulation. So this is not all stress. Some stress the body is very, very capable at metabolizing. Big stress, however, it can change the cycle and delay ovulation. So I talk about this a lot more in my program. So these are the answers to these questions. If you would like to ask me anything else, if this video has brought up even more questions, then please reach out to me via my email or my Instagram account, and I'd be very happy to talk with you about it. All right. Thank you so much for joining.